I woke up to discover my entire firewood pile had vanished overnight during the worst cold snap Minnesota had seen in 20 years. Standing on my back porch in 14-degree weather, staring at the empty spot where 2 cords of seasoned oak had been stacked just yesterday, I felt my stomach drop. That wood represented 6 months of careful preparation and over $700 in value. My elderly furnace had already been struggling, and I'd been relying on my fireplace to keep my heating bills manageable while staying warm. The snow around the empty space was trampled with footprints and tire tracks. Someone hadn't just taken a few logs. They'd backed a trailer right up to my property line and cleaned me out completely. My first thought was theft, obviously, but something about the neat way everything had been removed made me suspicious. This wasn't some random crime. This had the fingerprints of organization all over it. I pulled out my phone and called my neighbor, Derek, who lived 3 houses down. He answered on the second ring, his voice groggy. "Nathan, it's 7 in the morning, man. My firewood's gone, all of it. Did you see or hear anything last night?" There was a pause. "Wait, your whole pile, the one you spent all summer cutting, every last piece." "I've got tracks in the snow leading toward the street, but they're already getting covered by this morning's flurries." Derek let out a low whistle. "That's bold. You call the cops yet?" "About to. Just wanted to check if you'd noticed anything first." "Nothing, but I'll keep my eyes open." "That's messed up, Nathan, especially in this cold." I thanked him and hung up, then dialed the non-emergency police line. While I waited for someone to pick up, I walked around the perimeter of where my woodpile had been, taking photos with my phone. The tracks were clear enough despite the fresh snow. Someone with a decent-sized vehicle had done this, probably a truck and trailer combination. The wood hadn't just been tossed in haphazardly either. This had taken time and effort. The dispatcher took my information and said an officer would be out within a few hours to file a report. I went back inside, cranked up my struggling furnace, and made coffee while fuming. My house in Edna's Cahill Village neighborhood had always been peaceful. I'd moved here 3 years ago specifically because it seemed like a quiet, safe community. The homeowner association was a bit strict, sure, but I'd never had any real problems with them beyond the occasional notice about keeping my lawn trimmed to exact specifications. I was on my second cup of coffee when I saw a silver Lexus SUV pull into my driveway. My chest tightened when I recognized it. Patricia Nordstrom, the HOA president, climbed out wearing a camel-colored wool coat and designer boots completely inappropriate for the weather. She was in her mid-50s, with that particular haircut that seemed to be standard issue for women in her position, short, blonde, and aggressively styled. She'd been a thorn in my side since I'd accidentally left my trash cans visible from the street past noon on a collection day. I opened the door before she could ring the bell. "Patricia, what can I do for you?" Her smile was tight and practiced. "Good morning, Nathan. I'm here about the fire code violation." "Fire code violation?" I stepped out onto the porch, letting the cold air hit me. "What are you talking about?" She pulled out her phone and showed me a photograph. It was my woodpile, taken from my backyard. "This." She said it like she was showing me evidence of murder. "You've been storing firewood in violation of HOA regulations and local fire codes. The stack was over 6 feet from your house, but our bylaws clearly state that combustible materials must be stored at least 15 feet from any dwelling." I stared at her. "That's what you're here about." "Patricia, someone stole my firewood last night, all of it." "Stole?" She blinked, and for just a second, something flickered across her face. "Well, I wouldn't say stolen. The HOA exercised its right to remove the violation after you failed to respond to our notice." The world seemed to tilt slightly. "What notice?" the one we placed in your mailbox 3 days ago. You had 72 hours to remedy the situation, and when you failed to do so, we took appropriate action." My hands clenched into fists at my sides. "You took my firewood. You're admitting that right now. The HOA removed a fire hazard, yes. We acted within our authority as outlined in Section 12.7 of the Community Bylaws. That would cost me over $700. You can't just take someone's property, Patricia." Her expression hardened. "We can and did remove a violation. The wood has been disposed of properly. If you'd like to contest this action, you're welcome to attend next month's HOA meeting and file a formal complaint. Now, you'll also be receiving a fine of $250 for the initial violation, which must be paid within 30 days. Disposed of." My voice rose despite my attempt to stay calm. "Where is it? That's not your concern. The violation has been remedied. Have a good day, Nathan." She turned on her designer heels and walked back to her Lexus. I stood there watching her drive away, my mind racing. The casual way she'd admitted to taking my property was stunning. She genuinely seemed to believe the HOA had some legal right to confiscate my belongings without any due process. The notice she'd mentioned never made it to my hands. I checked my mail religiously. Either she was lying about sending it, or someone had removed it before I could see it. The police officer arrived around 10:30. Officer Mike Chen was younger than I expected, probably in his late 20s, with a professional demeanor that immediately put me at ease. I explained the situation, showed him the empty space where my wood had been, and then dropped the bomb about Patricia's visit. His eyebrows rose. "She admitted to taking it, verbatim. Said the HOA removed it as a fire code violation. Claimed she sent me a notice I never received." Officer Chen pulled out his notebook and started writing. "And you're saying this wood was worth over $700? At least. I had receipts from when I purchased some of it, and I can document the cost of the chainsaw work and splitting for the rest. 2 full cords of seasoned oak. Current market value around here is at least $350 to $400 per cord." He nodded slowly. "In Minnesota, theft of property valued over $500 is a felony. Did you give her permission to remove this wood?" "Absolutely not. I didn't even know there was supposedly a problem until she showed up this morning to gloat about it." "And you never received any written notice?" "Never. I check my mail every day. If there was something, I would have seen it and dealt with it." Officer Chen looked thoughtful. "Here's the thing. Even if there was a legitimate HOA violation, they don't have the right to just take your property without following proper legal channels. They would need to fine you, and if you didn't pay, they could place a lien on your house. But physically removing your belongings, that's theft, regardless of what their bylaws say." Relief washed over me. "So what happens now? I'm going to file this report as a theft case. The value puts it in felony territory, which means detectives will likely want to follow up. You should gather all your documentation, receipts, photos, anything showing the value of the wood. Also, get a copy of your HOA bylaws and any communication you've had with them. If they really did this thinking they had authority, they're in for a rude awakening." He spent another 20 minutes taking detailed notes, photographing the scene, and getting Patricia's contact information. Before he left, he handed me a case number and advised me to document any further contact with the HOA. I thanked him and watched him drive away, feeling both validated and anxious. Taking on an HOA was notoriously difficult, but this wasn't just about policy disputes. This was straight-up theft. I spent the rest of the day gathering documentation. I found the receipt from the tree service that had cut down a dead oak on my property last spring and sold me half the resulting wood for $250. I had bank records showing payments to a guy who'd split and stacked the rest over the summer. Another $200. Then there were the receipts from purchasing additional wood in the fall from a local supplier. Another $350. All told, I could document just over $800 in direct costs, not counting the value of my own labor. I also pulled up the HOA bylaws from the community website. Section 12.7 did mention fire safety, but it only talked about open burning and the storage of gasoline and propane. There was nothing about firewood placement specifically. The only mention of distance requirements was a vague statement about maintaining safe conditions, but nothing with the 15-foot specification Patricia had cited. My phone rang around 3 in the afternoon. Unknown number, but I answered anyway. "Hello, is this Nathan Alvarez?" A woman's voice, professional and brisk, speaking. "This is Detective Sarah Morrison with the Edna Police Department. I've been assigned to your theft case. Officer Chen's report just came across my desk and I have some questions. Do you have time to talk?" "Absolutely. Thank you for calling." I've dealt with HOA disputes before, but I'll be honest, I've never seen one cross into criminal territory quite like this. The president actually admitted to taking your property, word for word. She said they removed it as a fire code violation, didn't even try to hide it. Detective Morrison was quiet for a moment. "That's either incredibly bold or incredibly stupid. Walk me through everything again from the beginning." I recounted the entire story, from discovering the missing wood to Patricia's visit to my documentation of the value. The detective asked pointed questions about the timeline, the condition of the wood, and my attempts to comply with any HOA regulations. When I explained that I'd never received any notice, she asked about my mail situation. Did I have a locking mailbox? Had I noticed any other missing mail? That sort of thing. "My mailbox locks, and I have the only key. I check it every evening when I get home from work. If there was a notice, either it was never sent or someone took it out before I could see it." "Is it possible the HOA has a key to your mailbox?" That stopped me cold. I never considered that. It's one of those standard cluster box units at the end of the street. The HOA manages the common areas, so I guess they could have master keys. Worth looking into. Tampering with mail is a federal offense. I'm going to need to interview Patricia Nordstrom. Based on what you've told me and Officer Chen's report, there's probable cause to believe a theft occurred. The value puts it at a 5th-degree felony under Minnesota law. I'll be in touch. She hung up, and I sat down heavily on my couch. This was really happening. The HOA president might actually face criminal charges over firewood. Part of me felt vindicated, but another part was anxious. HOAs had a reputation for making life miserable for residents who crossed them, and Patricia struck me as the vindictive type. That evening, Derek came over with a 6-pack of beer and moral support. We sat in my living room with the fireplace sadly empty, the furnace running constantly to keep up with the cold. "So she really just admitted it?" Derek asked, popping open a can. "Just straight up told you they took it? Like she was doing me a favor." The arrogance was unbelievable. "Patricia's been getting worse lately. She fined the Johnsons $300 last month because their Christmas lights were white instead of warm white. Said it violated the aesthetic guidelines." "You're kidding." "I wish." Tom Johnson fought it, went to a meeting with his color temperature specs printed out, showing they were within the acceptable range. She added another $100 fine for disruptive behavior at the meeting. Derek shook his head. "Most people just pay whatever she demands because it's easier than fighting." "Well, she picked the wrong person this time. That wood was my safety net for this cold snap. Without it, My heating bill is going to be insane, and I'm legitimately worried my furnace is going to die. You need to go after her hard on this. People in the neighborhood are scared of her, but if someone finally stands up and wins, it might change things. We talked late into the evening, and Derek mentioned something interesting. Another neighbor, Margaret Wu, had her vintage truck towed by the HOA last year because Patricia decided it was an eyesore. Margaret had threatened to sue, but eventually backed down when Patricia implied there would be escalating fines and problems. The truck had been worth about $1,500, and Margaret had never gotten it back from the tow company because the fees had exceeded its value. "Where's Margaret now?" I asked. "Still lives here, 2 streets over. She just keeps her head down now, drives a boring sedan." After Derek left, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Margaret and the Johnsons and all the other people Patricia had bullied over the years. The firewood was valuable, sure, but this was about more than money. It was about someone using a position of petty power to run roughshod over people's rights. The next morning, I got a call from Detective Morrison. "Nathan, I interviewed Patricia Nordstrom yesterday evening. I need you to come down to the station to review a statement." "What did she say?" "Better if we discuss it in person. Can you come in today?" I took a long lunch break and drove to the Edna police station. Detective Morrison met me in a conference room with a manila folder in front of her. She was a tall African-American woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. "Patricia confirmed everything you told me," she said without preamble. "She admitted that the HOA contracted with a junk removal service to take your firewood, and she authorized the removal personally. She maintains it was legal under the HOA's enforcement authority. It wasn't, though, right? Not even close. I spoke with the city attorney this morning. An HOA can levy fines and, if unpaid, place liens on properties. They can take you to civil court. What they cannot do is physically remove your property without a court order. That's theft, plain and simple. The fact that she truly believed she had the authority doesn't change the criminal nature of the act. So, what happens now?" Detective Morrison opened the folder and slid a document across to me. "This is a statement of what she told me. I need you to rate it and confirm it matches what she said to you. If it does, I'm going to recommend charges to the county attorney." I read through Patricia's statement. She'd been remarkably detailed, explaining that she'd noticed my woodpile during a routine neighborhood inspection 3 weeks ago. She documented it as a violation, sent a notice to my address via regular mail, and when I didn't respond within the prescribed 72 hours, she'd authorized a company called Twin Cities Property Services to remove it. She'd paid them $350 out of HOA funds. The wood had been taken to a recycling facility where it was mulched and disposed of. "This is consistent with what she told me," I said, "but I still never got any notice." About that, I checked with the postal inspector. Tampering with cluster mailboxes is an ongoing issue in some neighborhoods. We can't prove whether she actually sent the notice or if someone removed it, but here's the thing: even if you had received it, she still didn't have the legal right to take your property. A notice doesn't grant them seizure authority. So this is moving forward. The county attorney will make the final call, but yes, I'm recommending charges. Theft by taking, value over $500. That's a felony charge. She'll likely be arrested within the next few days. The word arrested hit me hard. This was real. Patricia was going to face actual criminal consequences. What about the wood? Can I get it back or get compensated? The wood is gone, destroyed. But you can pursue civil restitution as part of the criminal case, and you can also file a civil lawsuit against her and the HOA. I'd recommend talking to a lawyer about your options. I left the police station feeling surreal. By the time I got home, word had apparently spread. My phone had 3 messages from different neighbors, all asking if it was true that Patricia had been investigated by police. I didn't respond. This was still too raw, too uncertain. 2 days later, on a Friday morning, I was working from home when I saw police cars pull up to Patricia's house 4 doors down. Through my window, I watched as Detective Morrison and 2 uniformed officers approached her front door. Patricia answered in yoga pants and an expensive-looking sweater. The conversation lasted maybe 2 minutes before I saw Morrison holding up handcuffs. Even from a distance, I could see Patricia's face go red. She gestured wildly, clearly arguing, but eventually she put her hands behind her back. They cuffed her and walked her to one of the police cars. My phone exploded. Derek texted first, "Dude, are you seeing this?" Then came messages from half a dozen other neighbors who knew about the situation. The neighborhood Facebook group, which I rarely checked, had apparently gone into meltdown mode. Patricia was released on her own recognizance later that day. By evening, I had a letter slipped under my door from the HOA's law firm, Keller and Baines. It informed me that the HOA was calling an emergency meeting to discuss my harassment and filing of false charges against Patricia. The meeting was scheduled for the following Wednesday. I called a lawyer the next morning. Thomas Reeves specialized in property law and HOA disputes. His office was in downtown Minneapolis, and he agreed to see me that afternoon. Reeves was a stocky man in his 60s with gray hair and a friendly demeanor that probably put opposing counsel off guard before he destroyed them in court. I explained the entire situation, showed him all my documentation, and mentioned the upcoming HOA meeting. "Don't go," he said immediately. "That meeting is a trap. They're going to try to paint you as the aggressor, probably vote to fine you or take some action that makes you look like the problem. Once criminal charges are filed, you don't engage with the defendant through other channels. It compromises the case. What about the notice they're threatening? I'll handle it. I'm going to send the HOA board a letter explaining that you're represented by counsel and that any communication should go through me. I'm also going to file a civil suit on your behalf against Patricia personally and the HOA as an organization. We're going to seek full restitution for the value of the wood, compensation for your increased heating costs during the cold snap, and punitive damages for the willful nature of the theft. How much are we talking? I'd say we go for $10,000 total. The actual damages are around $1,000 when you factor in your heating costs. The rest is punitive. HOAs need to learn they can't behave like little dictatorships. What's this going to cost me? My retainer is $1,500. If we win, which I'm confident we will, the judgment will include legal fees. You'll get that back. I wrote the check and left his office feeling better than I had since this started. Having a professional on my side made the whole situation feel manageable. The emergency HOA meeting happened without me. According to Derek, who attended, it was chaos. Patricia didn't show up apparently on advice of her criminal defense attorney. The vice president, a nervous man named Harold who I'd barely interacted with, tried to run the meeting but lost control quickly. Neighbors split into factions. Some defended Patricia, saying I was overreacting and should have just moved the wood when asked. Others, including Derek and Margaret Wu, spoke up about Patricia's pattern of overreach and bullying. It got heated, Derek told me later over the phone. Margaret stood up and talked about her truck situation. Then the Johnsons mentioned the Christmas light fines. By the end, Harold called for a vote of no confidence in Patricia's leadership. It barely failed, like 12-9. So she's still HOA president? Technically, but she's suspended pending the outcome of the criminal case. Harold's acting president for now. He already said he's not going after you for anything and that the HOA is hiring its own lawyer to separate itself from Patricia's actions. They're trying to claim she acted alone without board approval. That's interesting. Is it true? Honestly, I don't know. The board meetings are usually just Patricia telling everyone what she decided, and they rubber stamp it. But there might not be documentation showing they approved the firewood removal specifically. The criminal case moved faster than I expected. Patricia's arraignment was set for 2 weeks out. The county attorney charged her with felony theft and added a count of misconduct by a public servant, even though an HOA president wasn't technically a public servant. That second charge didn't stick past the preliminary hearing, but the theft charge did. Patricia pleaded not guilty and hired a high-profile defense attorney from a big firm in Minneapolis. Her strategy became clear at the preliminary hearing, which I attended. Her lawyer argued that Patricia had a good faith belief she was acting within her authority as HOA president. She had relied on the bylaws, taken what she thought were proper steps, and genuinely believed she was protecting the community from a fire hazard. The theft charge required criminal intent, her lawyer argued, and there was no intent to permanently deprive Nathan of his property for personal gain. She disposed of it as a violation remedy. The judge didn't buy it. He found probable cause to proceed to trial, noting that ignorance of the law wasn't a defense, and that taking someone's property without legal authority, regardless of motive, constituted theft under Minnesota statute. Meanwhile, my civil case was progressing. Reeves filed the lawsuit in Hennepin County District Court. The HOA's insurance company immediately got involved because the suit named both Patricia and the organization. Insurance adjusters started poking around, interviewing neighbors, pulling HOA records. It came out that Patricia had spent HOA funds on the junk removal service without board authorization. The board had given her discretion to spend up to $500 on enforcement actions without approval, but only after violations were properly documented through the official process. There was no record of her bringing my woodpile up at any board meeting or following the enforcement protocol outlined in the bylaws. This split the HOA board badly. 3 members resigned in protest. New board members were elected in a special meeting, and one of their first acts was to vote to settle my civil case. Their insurance company had advised them that fighting it would cost more than settling, especially given the criminal charges against Patricia. Reeves called me with the settlement offer. They're offering $8,000, full restitution, no admission of organizational liability, and they'll reform their enforcement policies to include proper legal oversight. What do you think? Take it. The criminal case is still pending, which is where Patricia's accountability really lies. This gets you made whole and puts pressure on her. If the HOA settles and she's left holding the bag criminally, her defense gets weaker. I agreed to the settlement. The check arrived within a week, minus Reeves's fees. I paid off the increased heating bills from the cold snap, bought 3 new cords of properly seasoned firewood, and had enough left over to upgrade my furnace with a new high-efficiency unit. The irony wasn't lost on me that Patricia's theft had ended up funding actual fire safety improvements to my home. The criminal trial was scheduled for August, nearly 6 months after the initial theft. Patricia's lawyer filed multiple motions to dismiss, all denied. They tried to get the felony reduced to a misdemeanor, arguing that the value was unclear. The prosecutor brought in an expert who assessed replacement value of the wood at $850, firmly in felony territory. They tried to suppress Patricia's statements to Detective Morrison, claiming they were made without understanding her Miranda rights. The judge ruled that she wasn't in custody during the interview and had spoken voluntarily. As the trial approached, I got a call from the prosecutor's office. They wanted me to testify. I'd already given a deposition, but they wanted me on the stand for the jury. The trial was expected to last 3 days. I took time off work and showed up at the Hennepin County Government Center on the first day of trial. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with maybe 30 seats for spectators. Most were full. Apparently, HOA disputes getting criminal had attracted attention. I recognized several neighbors, including Derek, Margaret, and the Johnsons. Patricia sat at the defense table in a conservative navy suit, her hair styled perfectly, wearing minimal makeup. She looked smaller somehow, diminished from the imperious woman who'd shown up at my door 8 months ago. Her lawyer was a sharp-dressed man in his 40s who projected confidence. The jury selection took most of the first day. By the time I was called to testify on day 2, the prosecution had already established the timeline and value of the wood. An investigator from Twin Cities Property Services had testified that Patricia hired them to remove yard waste from my property. They'd hauled it to a mulching facility, where it was destroyed. He confirmed they'd been paid $350 from an HOA account Patricia controlled. When I took the stand, the prosecutor walked me through discovering the missing wood, documenting its value, and Patricia's visit where she admitted the removal. We went through the photos I'd taken, the receipts I'd kept, and my testimony that I'd never received any notice of a violation. Then came cross-examination. Patricia's lawyer approached with a sympathetic smile. "Mr. Alvarez, you live in a planned community with an HOA, correct?" "Yes. And when you purchased your home, you signed documents acknowledging you'd read and would abide by the HOA bylaws." "I signed closing documents, yes. Including a covenant agreement that specifically referenced the HOA's enforcement authority, I suppose so. It was 3 years ago." "You didn't read everything you signed." I felt my frustration rising. "I read the main points." "It's hundreds of pages of documents. So it's possible you agreed to enforcement provisions you don't remember. Even if I did, that doesn't give anyone the right to steal my property." The judge sustained the prosecutor's objection before the lawyer could respond. The cross-examination continued, with him trying to establish that I'd been negligent in not maintaining HOA standards, that the wood was a potential fire hazard, and that Patricia had acted reasonably under stress and time pressure. When he asked if I thought Patricia had acted out of malice or genuine concern for community safety, I paused. I think she acted like the rules didn't apply to her, whether that's malice or arrogance or just being so used to power that she forgot about basic property rights. I don't know. But she took my stuff without permission, and that's theft no matter how you frame it. The defense rested without calling Patricia to testify. Her lawyer put on an expert witness about HOA governance who talked about the pressures and complexities of managing community associations. The prosecutor countered with a legal expert who testified that no HOA bylaw could supersede state criminal statutes, and that property seizure without court authority was illegal regardless of the community agreement. Closing arguments were powerful on both sides. The defense painted Patricia as a dedicated volunteer, overwhelmed by responsibility, who made an honest mistake in judgment. The prosecution argued that good intentions didn't excuse criminal conduct, and that Patricia had stolen valuable property, knowing full well she was taking something that didn't belong to her. The jury deliberated for 5 hours. I sat in a coffee shop across from the courthouse with Derek, my phone clutched in my hand, waiting for the call. When it came, my heart raced. They've reached a verdict. We rushed back to the courtroom. Patricia looked pale as the jury filed in. The foreperson stood when asked if they'd reached a verdict. "We have, Your Honor. On the charge of theft of property valued over $500, we find the defendant guilty." Patricia's face crumpled. Her lawyer put a hand on her shoulder. Behind me, I heard Margaret Wu let out a quiet yes. Sentencing was set for 6 weeks later. Minnesota's sentencing guidelines for a first-offense fifth-degree felony were complicated. Patricia faced up to 5 years in prison and $10,000 in fines, but first-time offenders rarely got maximum sentences for property crimes. I attended the sentencing hearing. The prosecutor asked for jail time, even if minimal, to send a message that abusing authority had consequences. Patricia's lawyer pleaded for probation, highlighting her lack of criminal history, her community involvement, and the civil settlement I'd already received. Patricia herself gave a statement. She stood at the podium, her voice shaking. "I want to apologize to Mr. Alvarez. I genuinely believed I was acting in the community's best interest. I realize now how wrong I was. I let the responsibility of leadership cloud my judgment, and I took an action I had no legal right to take. I've lost my position, my reputation, and now my freedom is in jeopardy. I understand the consequences of my actions, and I accept responsibility." It sounded rehearsed, but there was genuine emotion there. I almost felt sorry for her until I remembered how she'd treated Margaret and the Johnsons and countless others over the years. This wasn't a one-time mistake. This was a pattern of behavior that had finally crossed a legal line. The judge considered for a long moment before pronouncing sentence. "Mrs. Nordstrom, this case troubles me deeply. We live in a society governed by laws, not the arbitrary decisions of individuals, no matter how well-intentioned. You believed you had authority you did not possess, and you exercised that imagined authority to deprive someone of their property. The fact that you thought you were right makes it worse, not better, because it shows how completely you misunderstood the limits of your power. However, I also recognize this is a first offense, and that you've already suffered significant consequences. I sentence you to 90 days in county jail, with credit for time served, followed by 2 years of supervised probation. You'll also pay restitution to Mr. Alvarez in the amount of $1,000, separate from the civil settlement. This restitution is specifically for the increased hardship during the cold weather emergency. Additionally, you are prohibited from serving in any HOA leadership capacity during your probation. Do you understand these terms?" Patricia nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, Your Honor." She was taken into custody immediately to begin serving her sentence. I watched the bailiff lead her away in handcuffs, feeling a complicated mix of vindication and sadness. Justice had been served, but there was no real satisfaction in seeing someone broken like that. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded me. The case had gotten regional media attention as a cautionary tale about HOA overreach. I gave a brief statement about property rights and the importance of legal accountability, then escaped to my car. Derek called as I drove home. "Man, 90 days. That's real jail time. She'll probably serve 60 with good behavior, but yeah, it's real." "How do you feel?" "Honestly, exhausted. I just want this to be over." "It is over, buddy. You won. And you changed things for the neighborhood. The new HOA board is completely different. They're actually working with people instead of dictating to them." He was right. The leadership shakeup had transformed the neighborhood association. Harold, who'd taken over as permanent president, sent a letter to all residents apologizing for Patricia's actions and outlining new enforcement procedures that included proper notice, opportunity to respond, and legal review before any significant action. The heavy-handed approach was gone. Over the following months, life slowly returned to normal. Patricia served her jail time and began her probation. I saw her once after her release at the grocery store. We made eye contact across the produce section. She looked away quickly, grabbed her items, and left. I didn't feel anger anymore, just a distant kind of pity. The neighborhood changed in subtle ways. People seemed more willing to be themselves, to push back against petty rules, to remember that an HOA was supposed to serve the community, not rule it. Margaret Wu got a new vintage truck, a beautiful restored Ford from the 70s, and parked it proudly in her driveway. The Johnsons put up elaborate Christmas lights in whatever color temperature they wanted. Nobody said a word. My new furnace worked perfectly through the next winter. The firewood pile I'd carefully rebuilt sat unmolested in my backyard, properly seasoned and ready for use. I installed a security camera pointed at it, just in case, but I never needed it. One evening in late fall, almost a year after the whole ordeal began, I was splitting wood in my backyard when Harold walked over from his house. He turned out to be a reasonable guy, genuinely interested in making the neighborhood better rather than exerting control. "Hey Nathan, got a minute?" "Sure, what's up?" "I wanted to thank you. I know the whole thing with Patricia was hell for you, but it needed to happen. She'd been getting worse for years, and everyone was too scared to call her out. You standing up to her broke that cycle. I just wanted my firewood back." "Everything else kind of snowballed," Harold smiled. "Maybe, but you saw it through. A lot of people would have dropped it after the civil settlement. You could have let her walk away with a slap on the wrist. It wasn't about punishment, it was about accountability. She needed to understand that rules apply to everyone, even people in charge." "Well, mission accomplished. The new board is talking about nominating you for a position. You interested?" I laughed. "God, no. I've had enough HOA drama for a lifetime." "Fair enough. But if you change your mind, we could use someone with your perspective." After he left, I kept splitting wood, the rhythm of the maul hitting the logs meditative and satisfying. I thought about everything that had happened, from that first morning of discovering the theft to watching Patricia led away in handcuffs to this quiet evening of simple work. The whole experience had taught me something important about power and accountability. Patricia hadn't been evil or even particularly malicious. She'd just been so convinced of her own rightness, so surrounded by people who wouldn't challenge her, that she'd lost sight of basic boundaries. The HOA structure had enabled that, creating a little kingdom where she could impose her will without meaningful oversight. But systems only work when people hold them accountable. If I just paid the fine and accepted the loss, Patricia would have kept going, getting bolder, hurting more people. Sometimes you have to stand up and say no, even when it's exhausting and uncertain and would be easier to just let it go. My phone buzzed with a text from Derek. "Fire at my place tonight. Bring beer." I looked at my newly split wood, the security camera keeping watch, my warm house with its efficient furnace. Everything I'd fought for and more. The neighborhood felt like home again, maybe for the first time since I'd moved in. I texted back, "Be there in an hour." That evening, sitting around Derek's fireplace with half a dozen neighbors, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Real community. Not the forced, regulated version Patricia had tried to impose, but the organic kind that comes from people choosing to be decent to each other. We talked and laughed, told stories, made plans for a neighborhood barbecue in the spring. Margaret Wu raised her beer at one point. To Nathan for having the guts to do what needed doing. Everyone echoed the toast. I felt my face flush. It wasn't courage. I was just pissed off about my firewood. Sometimes that's all it takes, Margaret said. Being pissed off enough to not let something go. Most people just accept it when they get screwed by authority figures. You didn't. Later that night, walking home under a clear, cold sky full of stars, I thought about that. Maybe Margaret was right. Maybe the difference between accepting injustice and fighting it wasn't some grand moral principle, but just being stubborn enough to say this isn't right and following through. The next morning, I got a letter from Patricia's probation officer. She wanted to meet with me as part of Patricia's rehabilitation process. Apparently, making amends was part of the probation terms. I agreed to meet, curious what Patricia would say. We met at a neutral coffee shop in Eden Prairie, away from our neighborhood. Patricia arrived looking nothing like the imperious HOA president I'd known. She wore jeans and a simple sweater, minimal makeup, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. She looked tired and older. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," she said, sitting down across from me. "I know you didn't have to. What is it you want to say? I'm not asking for forgiveness. What I did was wrong and I've accepted the consequences. But I wanted you to understand why I acted the way I did, not as an excuse, but because you deserve to know." I sipped my coffee and waited. I became HOA president 5 years ago. I'd just gone through a divorce, my kids were grown and gone, and I was looking for purpose. The association gave me that. I liked the order, the rules, the feeling that I could create something perfect. Over time, I got addicted to the control. When people pushed back, I saw it as a threat rather than legitimate disagreement. I convinced myself that I was protecting property values and community standards, but really, I was just feeding my need to be in charge of something. She paused, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup. "By the time I took your firewood, I was so deep in that mindset that it didn't even occur to me I was committing theft. In my head, I was just removing a violation. The fact that it was your property, that you had rights, that there was a legal process, none of that registered. And that terrifies me now, looking back. I'd become someone I don't recognize." "What changed?" I asked. "Jail. Sitting in a cell for 2 months with nothing but time to think. Losing everything I'd built. Seeing the fear in my own kids' eyes when they visited. I realized the person I'd become wasn't someone I wanted to be. I'm in therapy now, working through the control issues. I'm trying to figure out who Patricia Nordstrom actually is when she's not defining herself by authority over others." We talked for another half hour. She asked what she could do to make amends beyond the legal requirements. I told her the truth, that the best thing she could do was learn from this and never abuse power again, whether in an HOA or anywhere else. She nodded, tears in her eyes, and thanked me for my time. Walking out of that coffee shop, I felt something release in my chest. The anger I'd been carrying, the resentment, it wasn't gone completely, but it had softened. Patricia was just a person, flawed and struggling like everyone else. She'd made terrible choices, but she was taking responsibility and trying to change. Spring came to Minnesota with its usual dramatic suddenness. One day there was still snow on the ground, and the next, temperatures hit 70 and everything turned green. The neighborhood barbecue Derek had joked about actually happened. Harold organized it, getting permission to use the common area park. Half the neighborhood showed up. I brought a cooler of drinks and spent the afternoon talking to people I'd lived near for 3 years but barely knew. The Johnsons told funny stories about their kids. Margaret showed photos of her truck restoration project. A new family that had just moved in marveled at how friendly everyone was. "This is the best HOA we've ever dealt with," the husband said. Our last place, They fined us for planting the wrong shade of tulips. It wasn't always this good, Derek said, glancing at me. Took some serious action to turn things around. I didn't want to rehash the story, so I changed the subject. But later, as the sun set and people started heading home, Harold pulled me aside. I got a call from a reporter yesterday. They're doing a story about HOA reform in Minnesota. They want to interview you. About the Firewood thing. About how communities can change their governance structures to prevent abuse. Your case is being cited in proposed legislation about HOA oversight. Did you know that? I didn't. Apparently, a state representative had introduced a bill requiring HOAs to carry liability insurance and submit to regulatory oversight for enforcement actions. It was being called the Property Rights Protection Act, and my case was listed in the legislative history as a motivating example. I don't want to be the poster child for HOA reform, I told Harold. I just wanted to heat my house. Too late, he said with a grin. You're already famous in property law circles. Might as well use it for good. I eventually agreed to do the interview. The article ran in the Star Tribune and was picked up by several national news outlets. I got emails from people across the country who'd had similar experiences with overzealous HOAs. Some had won their battles, many had lost. All of them expressed gratitude that someone had finally held an HOA accountable through the criminal justice system. The legislative bill gained traction. By the end of the year, it passed with bipartisan support. HOAs in Minnesota now had to carry minimum liability insurance, provide detailed notice before enforcement actions, and allow homeowners to appeal to a state ombudsman before any property-related penalties were imposed. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Patricia completed her probation without incident. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she'd moved to Duluth to live near her daughter and grandkids. She was working at a library, staying away from any positions of authority. I hoped she'd found peace. 2 years after the Firewood theft, I was doing routine maintenance on my property when a car pulled up. A young couple got out, looking nervous. The woman approached me. "Are you Nathan Alvarez?" "Yes, I'm Jennifer, and this is my husband, Mark. We're thinking about buying a house in this neighborhood, but we've heard about HOA issues in the past. Is it really as good now as people say?" I leaned on my rake and smiled. "It's good. The HOA functions like it's supposed to, maintaining common areas, organizing community events, not harassing people over petty stuff. We've got solid bylaws now and board members who actually care about serving the community. But there was that criminal case a few years ago, right? The president went to jail. Yeah, that happened. It was a wake-up call for everyone about what can go wrong when there's no accountability. But the current board learned from it. They're transparent, they follow proper procedures, and they treat homeowners like adults." Jennifer and Mark looked relieved. "That's good to hear. We love the houses here, but we've had bad HOA experiences before. If you move in and ever have any issues, reach out. We've got a good network of neighbors who watch out for each other now." They thanked me and drove off. I went back to my yard work, thinking about how far the neighborhood had come. What had started as a fight over firewood had transformed an entire community's approach to governance. Not because I'd set out to be some crusader for justice, but because I'd simply refused to let someone steal from me without consequences. That evening, I built a fire in my fireplace, using wood from my carefully maintained pile. The flames crackled and popped, throwing warm light across my living room. Outside, the first snow of the season was falling, blanketing Edna in white. My furnace hummed quietly, working perfectly, but I kept the fire going anyway. There was something satisfying about the heat from wood I'd prepared myself, stored legally on my own property, protected by laws that now actually meant something. My phone buzzed with a text from Derek. "Game night next week. My place." I replied that I'd be there, then set the phone down and watched the fire. Somewhere in Duluth, Patricia was presumably living her new life, learning to be a person instead of an authority figure. The neighborhood that had been her kingdom had moved on, thriving without the iron-fisted control she'd thought was necessary. Justice had been served, not just in the courtroom but in the lasting changes that came from standing up to abuse of power. The firewood pile sitting safely in my backyard was a testament to that. So were the vintage truck in Margaret's driveway, the Johnsons' Christmas lights, and the relaxed, genuine community atmosphere that had replaced Patricia's regime of petty tyranny. I added another log to the fire and settled into my chair with a book. The house was warm, my heating bills were reasonable, and I was surrounded by neighbors who'd become real friends. All because I'd refused to let someone take what was mine without consequence, and had been stubborn enough to see it through when it would have been easier to just let it go. Sometimes the biggest changes come from the smallest stands. A pile of firewood stolen during a freeze had become a catalyst for reform, a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority, and a reminder that ordinary people have the power to demand accountability from those who govern them, even in something as mundane as a homeowner association. The snow continued to fall outside, but inside I was warm and content, surrounded by the fruits of that stubborn stand. Justice wasn't just about Patricia's conviction or the civil settlement. It was about this moment, this warmth, this security of knowing that rights meant something and that fighting for them mattered. I finished my book as the fire burned down to embers, then added one more log before heading to bed. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought, but tonight I was simply grateful to be home, in a neighborhood that had learned the hard way to value fairness over control, community over conformity, and rights over regulations. The firewood pile was just firewood again, valuable for the heat it provided rather than the principle it represented. And that, in the end, was the best victory of all.